because somebody else is sharing their screen. All right. So thank you guys for joining us for the COVIDeo series from the Food Co-op Initiative. Very excited today. We have a special guest. Before we get started, though, just going to go through the housekeeping real quick. We are recording today. Keep that in mind. It will be shared on YouTube. So anything you say will be public. Just keep it in mind as you're deciding what you want to say and what you want to comment on. Again, it's a video-based call. There will be a lot of time for discussion toward the end. So if you can be on video so we can see who we're talking with, we appreciate it. It just makes the conversation go better. It connects people as a startup community. If you can't, we understand. And we are going to stay very on topic today. I'm going to ask if folks have questions that aren't specifically about our e-commerce topic, that we put them off for another time, because this is a really rare opportunity. All of our speakers, we want to respect their time, but this is a particularly rare opportunity to talk about this topic that you guys have asked and asked and asked for more presentations on. So let's stay on topic. And this presenter today, I'm going to run the chat. So she's got a presentation for you all. I think we're going to keep most of the questions to the end, but we're planning to save plenty of time for that. There's going to be a lot of discussion and Q&A. So write those questions down or throw them in the chat, and just know that I will get to them and start at the top when we get to the Q&A section. So with that said, let's get into our topic. We are lucky to have with us today Michelle Schry from the National Cooperative Grocers, and she's here to talk to us today about what's really going on with e-commerce. So all your questions about curbside and online ordering and delivery, she's here to talk about what's happening at actual real co-ops, what it looks like on the ground, and answer your questions about how it might affect your future store. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Hello, everyone. Good to see everybody. I'm happy to be able to join you today. This is a topic that's definitely top of mind for everyone. Really, probably 3 or 4 years ago, e-commerce started to really invade the consciousness of pretty much every grocery retailer I know, and it's a hot topic for a lot of boards of directors as well. And pretty recently, in light of COVID-19, this is the kind of thing that's keeping a lot of GMs laying awake at night, both thinking about how they're going to bring a solution to bear really quickly and get it online. Also try to figure out how they can manage the costs associated with that, along with all of the other things that they've got going on right now. So I cope with stress through memes. This is one of my favorites, and in a lot of ways it I think echoes a little bit of what I think about e-commerce right now. I want to really start, and a lot of this conversation is going to be talking about what are the realities on the ground about e-commerce. And while there's a huge amount of conversation about e-commerce, and if you really listen to the trade magazines, you're probably under the impression that physical grocery stores are on the verge of becoming obsolete because e-commerce is growing at such a rapid pace. But as I tried to indicate to folks yesterday at my CCMA session, and I apologize for those of you who have seen that session, this is a repeat of some of that data, but we did have to go fast. So hopefully you can keep up and get a little bit more out of it today. But the reality is, if you look at the headlines in the trade magazines or really in the press at all, there's headlines shouting about this huge growth, 40, 50, 70% growth in online grocery sales on a monthly basis. And I really want to stop and think about what that means. Particularly because one of the things you'll notice in almost every single one of those articles is that there's a real absence of talking about what the real dollar value of those sales are compared to overall grocery spending. At the end of 2019, about 10% of shoppers were buying their groceries online at least every other week. And online grocery sales totally accounted for only 2 to 4% of all grocery sales. So that's at the end of last year, which is what, less than 6 months ago right now. And yes, e-commerce has exploded, quote unquote, since that time. And right now, e-commerce spend is hovering around between 8 and 9% of overall grocery sales. Now, I'm going to kind of show you this graph. This is a graph I actually pulled out of a Supermarket News article, which is a trade that I read every week. And this is the kind of graph that I see a lot, and it drives me insane because it's, I think, trying to tell a story, but it is a little bit misleading. If you look at the growth, you can see online versus in-store. I think they're trying to illustrate that online is growing faster. However, you don't have even any kind of axis markings to tell you what that growth is. It doesn't really tell you in real dollar value what the real size of each of those is. And it's tough. I mean, when you're going through these articles and taking a look at it, we're hearing about, for example, in this article that this graph came from, 37% growth for the month of April in online grocery sales. So being annoyed as I was about that, I decided to dig a little bit deeper and figure out what that really meant. And in April of 2020, which was right about the height of the coronavirus stock up, we're getting towards the bottom end. We're in March, we saw a big spike. We're still pretty high in April. Online sales of grocery and beverage accounted for $5.3 billion in total sales. Brick and mortar sales in that same period accounted for just shy of $64 billion, which made e-commerce about 8.28%. So we went from somewhere between 2 and 4% at the end of last year to, if you're generous, maybe doubling it during the pandemic period where sales were driving the most. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about e-commerce, over the next hour or so. And like, I know that this is a reality. This is something that we all have to wrestle with. But the critical piece that I don't want you to lose sight of is that by far the vast majority of grocery sales are still happening inside of brick and mortar stores. And I don't want you to lose sight of that. And it's really important that you don't lose sight of that for some reasons I'm going to illustrate a little bit later in my presentation. Now, when we talk about e-commerce, grocery stores in particular are looking at two different ways of fulfillment. One is click and collect. That's described as being a situation where someone goes to an online portal, maybe one that you yourself maintain or a third party maintains. They select products, put it into an online cart, and send the order to your store. Depending on whether you're doing self-fulfillment, as most retailers are, then you have staff go out, pick those products, assemble them into an order, and get it ready within a window that you've promised your shopper that it'll be available. The other option is for folks who get home delivery. And, that if you're a retailer might mean using a service like Instacart, or perhaps you have a partnership with a local logistics company or Uber Eats or a cab company that can send things out. Maybe you have your own delivery scheme in-house. But if we look at what portion of e-commerce was delivery versus click and collect, you can see almost 80% of fulfillment of e-commerce orders was done through a delivery method during that COVID period of, here I think it's telling us they're looking at March 7th through April 11th. So that was a pretty big stock up period. And you'll see that though that delivery was the mass of that. And the reality is most retailers, small box retailers, chains, they're all using click and collect. So why is delivery so big? well, one word, Amazon. Amazon represents a huge proportion of all e-commerce grocery sales, particularly during this COVID period. And that means our retailer share period of that 8% of grocery sales is necessarily even smaller proportionately. So it's, again, I think it's really easy to hear one story as you're reading through the trades and looking at what the media is talking about. But as you dig a little bit farther, you realize there's a little bit more information that you need to make a good decision. So while there's been a few folks in the food co-op world who ventured into e-commerce early on, often it was because of their location inside of dense urban markets. A lot of food co-ops really weren't there yet when COVID-19 started to sweep the world. And today it's really tough for us to argue against the co-op having some kind of e-commerce option as a public health service to our members and shoppers. We know customers are demanding it, and circumstances put on us by the pandemic have left us looking for ways inside of our stores to deal with things that have been foisted upon us, such as customer metering. As some states have tried to flatten the curve, they've said you can only have so many people inside of your store based on your footprint. And because co-ops tend to have smaller retail footprints, that means in some locations, we've had co-ops where when you're counting staff, you can only have 5 or 6 customers in a store at any given time. That's tough. That's a really tough situation for our retailers. It's really tough to be able to generate enough sales when you've really throttled your ability to make sales so closely. We also obviously want to take care of social distancing. So online options give us a way to put a little bit more on the top line while we're dealing with the pandemic implications that are going on right now. So as we're thinking about our role, and we don't often, I think, take the time to think about the role that grocery stores play in our civil society, but I think it's a really important thing for us to think about. And the ability for people to feel like there isn't scarcity around basic necessities like food really helps calm, concerns and civil unrest related to that. In particular, we have lots of other civil unrest, which is well deserved, and that's another topic for another day. But the reality is, we really need to make sure that people feel like they can have access to those necessities of life. And e-commerce is one way for that to happen. So here's the reality, though. If we were not in a pandemic moment, really the advice that we're given to folks is this is a really tough thing to undertake, particularly for our smallest members. Now that we're in a situation where we have real public health issues, we have to look at it in a little bit different light. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more specifically as we go forward. So we have a lot of co-ops who are jumping into e-commerce, focused primarily on serving their members and serving their shoppers. But unfortunately, they don't really have a lot of preparation while they're jumping in. And almost none of them understand the impact that these programs are going to have on their financial performance. Here's a tough dose of reality. E-commerce is not a profit center. Even largest retailers out there haven't figured out how to make money at it. Kroger, Walmart, Aldi, they're all struggling to figure it out. Aldi actually only recently agreed to launch a curbside program because they knew that it conflicted with their ability to keep their prices low. They knew that the cost center would put them into negative territory. So there's a lot that we need to learn from outside of our own little bubble about how e-commerce is working. Now, it was interesting just yesterday as I was kind of getting ready to do my CCMA presentation on this topic, I read an article about Kroger announcing 3 more of their regional automated warehouses that they're building that are designed specifically just to service Kroger's e-commerce business. So essentially, Kroger, which is self-distributing, has designed warehouses specifically so that they don't have to do fulfillment of e-commerce orders from the retail space. And that's because here's the newsflash. It is incredibly inefficient for a warehouse to distribute its products out to a small retail. You receive that, you put it all on the shelf. An e-commerce order is then you pay someone to go and take that product back off of the shelf, pack it up, figure out the logistics for how someone is going to come and get it or deliver it to that customer in that last mile. We set up the economics of the modern grocery store back in 1916 when Piggly Wiggly launched that first self-service grocery store. They were able to drive prices down because customers were providing that labor to us. They were doing their own selection. It wasn't the grocer standing behind the counter picking stuff off of shelves and filling bags. We've created an environment where we have 1% to 2% net income, and the costs of that labor are incredibly high. We've done some internal research, and again, a lot of it is anecdotal because many of our co-ops have struggled to be able to do their own analysis. But what we recognize is on average, it takes folks are 6.5%. Now, let me rephrase this. I want to make sure I say it correctly. We're 6.5 times more efficient putting product on the shelf than we are taking it off. It takes 6.5 times longer to pick product off of the shelf than it does to load product onto a shelf when we're stocking. And so it's not merely replicating those stocking hours. We're actually exponentially increasing those stocking hours as we're doing fulfillment. And you know, when I listened to a co-op who presented on yesterday's session at CCMA, the efficiency level that their co-op is doing is even lower than that. So it's a struggle. It's a real struggle. And we have a 1% to 2% net business, and building that amount of labor, just the labor, forget all of the platform costs, the transaction fees, the setup costs, the IT management, just putting the labor back in generally takes all of the profitability out of those transactions and actually drives them into a negative territory. So unless we can figure out a way to build this into the budgets of our business, you know, either by figuring out how to make those transactions profitable. And again, I want to say, even the big guys are struggling with that. That Kroger warehouse is fully automated. They have robots picking because they can't figure out how to pay for warehouse labor to be able to pick those e-commerce orders and still make them profitable. So this is something I think is going to be really tough, particularly for our small independent businesses. We're really encouraging folks to think about what are all of the costs that go into this. And again, this is something where we're trying to help build templates for folks to be able to more quickly do their own analysis. It's tough, it's expensive, it's a really challenging thing. I think as I think about this in terms of a startup, this is a really tough thing to try to build into your business model up front. You know, when you do it, one of the things I think is important to think about is as you agree to take on these costs, whether it's as a member service or a public health service, it's really critical to think about what it is you're willing to give up in order to be able to provide that service. There are lots of ways that folks have tried to recoup some of those costs. Some retailers out there, the big guys, even some of the small guys, a few of our co-ops I know, actually charge a different cost at the retail level for the online platform than they do in store. You pay more to buy things from their e-commerce platform than you do on store. Every time I say that out loud, the head of Kelly Smith, our marketing and communications director at NCG, her head almost melts off because of the impact that has on your brand. But this is a serious, this kind of program can have a serious impact, particularly as usage goes up. In many cases, when you have a program that may not be profitable, sometimes it's a function of volume. If you can drive additional volume, it can take the costs, which are fairly fixed, and spread them out over larger amounts of sales, and you can get to a place where eventually you can come out on the other side. We're not necessarily seeing that in e-commerce right now because the costs really increase as the number of orders go up. We haven't yet figured out how to limit that. We've made a number of recommendations for things that people could try to do labor-wise, but it is very, very challenging, and we don't purport to have the solutions on it. And prior to the pandemic, the recommendation that I made to many of our stores was, look, we know that this is something that the world is trying to make happen. It hadn't really happened yet. You know, we aren't at 30 or 40% of people doing their shopping online. We were at like 2 to 4%. And what I would say is our pockets aren't deep enough to figure that out. We can't afford to have quarter after quarter losses while we try to solve those problems. Kroger and Walmart and some of the larger retail operations, they can absorb some of those costs, and they're learning and they're making investments that they're hoping will teach them about how to make it more profitable. Prior to COVID-19, my recommendation was, look, unless you're in a location where it really makes sense, where you have a lot of density, I'd say let the big guys figure it out. Take your time. And I would still say that for many folks, if you are in a location where perhaps you have folks who are already providing that service, you aren't the only game in town, it might be okay to decide to let them have that for the interim term while we continue to chip away and try to solve that. Particularly if you have a budget that already looks tight. This is going to be a tough one. For those of you who feel like you have to get into it, I would say it's time to sharpen your pencils, go back to your pro formas, and think about what you're going to eliminate in order to be able to ensure that you can provide this service without putting yourselves out of business. So there's the financial part of it. But one of the things that I really want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about is also, how does e-commerce really integrate with the strategic focus of your business? For food co-ops, for many years, relationships have been the core of what it is that we do. It's been being that third place in a community, the place where people gather around something that they have in common. They learn together, they commune together, they break bread together. The thing I love about going into co-ops are seeing people who can't manage to get through the store in less than 45 minutes because they're stopping every few feet to greet their neighbors. COVID-19 is making that really tough to do. We're in a place of having to balance staff safety, shopper safety, but as we think about long term, how do we find ways for e-commerce to integrate in a sensible way that long term isn't going to jeopardize that strategic advantage? I also think it's really important for you to think about, if you're in the process of store design right now and you're committed to that, what does it take? Have you spent time talking to folks who are doing these kinds of operations right now to understand what it takes? I thought yesterday the gentleman who was presenting on his co-ops program, talking about how it had really overtaken many of the spaces inside of their store to be able to service, whether you have appropriate cold and frozen storage, do you have space to stage these items, do you have the amount of staff that's going to be required to service both folks in store at a time when the demands for cleaning and sanitation are ramped up as well. How can you create something that will be efficient while also thinking about how you're going to manage a fee structure that might help take some of the burden off, how you can build the costs into your budget to make sure that you're not coming out at the negative end at the end of the day. We also have something that we haven't talked about coming, which is what we expect to be a prolonged and deep economic recession. And we are technically, I just read, already in recession, and we expect that that will only deepen in the coming months. So your decision to take on a program that you know is not a moneymaker absolutely has implications in that kind of an economic environment. So let's face it, today 4% of retailers consider them to be sophisticated at deploying e-commerce based on research that Food Marketing Institute. And I have yet figured out a model that co-ops can emulate that would allow them to be able to do this effectively while also doing it in a sustainable manner. So I'm not a ray of sunshine today about e-commerce. I know that this is a really challenging situation and that there are many folks who feel that it's really important for you to be able to offer this and that it's something that's going to be critical. It's hard to argue in the current environment against that. However, it does put a whole slew of additional pressure on you, both to think about the operational impacts, but primarily the financial impacts of it. Right now, many of our co-ops who have leaped in the last 2 months to do e-commerce where they had no programs before are just now starting to understand what the impact of that has been on their co-ops and on their margins and on their labor. A lot of folks weren't able to do inventories at the end of first quarter. So for some of them, that information is going to be prolonged even more. It's going to be the end of this month before they're going to be able to figure that out. So I don't envy you. This is a tough decision to make. We recognize the need and the desire to service folks. There are a lot of people who've done a really commendable job of getting programs stood up and really serving their members incredibly well. And I really want to recognize that. And I'm happy to talk about platforms. We've spent a lot of time looking at every single one of them. I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can about those. I think what's really important for me is to be able to really kind of level set and make sure that you're getting some of a dose of reality about what a lot of the hype has been about, so that you can make better decisions as you move forward, considering where you're going to go on that. So Jacqueline, what do you think? Should we answer some questions?
I think we better start because this list is getting long.
All right, excellent. I'm going to stop my presentation so we can see one another.
All right. So this is interesting because you weren't at the presentation. We had a presentation done by Debbie Swasuna, Firebrand facilitated, but it was Debbie's material and what she was saying. And Debbie said she saw, and as Joy brought up from Cedar Falls, who was there, that she said curbside pickup at least was a must when looking at the future of being a grocery store and selecting a site. So I feel like I think there's some people feeling right now like you just made a really good case and we just heard this other thing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really tough, and I would say that it's going to be ubiquitous. There are a lot of people who are going to put it in knowing that they're not making money at it. I would say that as a startup food co-op, I'm not sure that you have the latitude that a lot of other folks have. I think it's something that, God, I hope in a couple of years we can figure out a way to make this happen. I will tell you, though, that based on what I'm seeing from the bigger retailers and the moves that they're making, they're not seeing a way to do fulfillment at the retail level and make money at it. They're actually saying, we need the dedicated space because it doesn't make sense to put stuff on the shelf and then pay somebody to take it back off the shelf and pack it up. And as I think about e-commerce without being in the grocery world, the reality is getting shipments from retailers is much less efficient than it is to just get it from a giant warehouse. And that's partly why I think why Amazon has such a huge leg up. But I'll tell you, I'm sure some of you may be closet Amazon shoppers. I pay attention to what they're doing as part of my responsibility. In the city where I live, Madison, Wisconsin, during the height of the stock up time in the pandemic, Amazon deliveries for pantry items were more than a month out. You could not get a delivery within 4 weeks in Madison for any foodstuffs because they were booked out so far. So even they weren't prepared for what the pandemic brought.
Excellent. We've got there's several people, Aideen and Keith, are talking about software and I'm going to save time at the end for software, but I think I'd like to get to more the crux of the issues and get back to software. So we'll do that toward the end. There was a request, could Michelle distill all of this down to a paragraph or two that we can use to communicate to our owners? I don't think Michelle probably can do that, but I would tell you what I can do is, it will not be tomorrow. I will put it on my work plan for the next couple weeks to attempt that and then get Michelle to read it over. How's that sound? Does that sound okay with you, Michelle? Can you read something over in a few weeks?
Sounds terrific.
Okay. So two paragraphs. That should be a fun project. I hear what you're saying, though. I think a lot of you were saying, yeah, right. Like we're saying, we heard you, Michelle, and wow, that was a solid case, and that makes sense. But, and startups tell me all the time, they're hearing intensive push from their owners to do this. That, saying, no, it just won't work. It's just not profitable. Or we just can't do it. I think to a lot of startups feels like telling a whole bunch of people who are otherwise enthusiastic about their co-op, we're not listening to you. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share on that, Michelle.
I have a couple of thoughts. And one is that sometimes being a leader requires you to do unpopular things, and that being a good leader also means as much knowing what not to do as it is knowing what to do, right? The easy decisions, boy, anyone can make the easy decisions. The real leader has to make the tough ones. So hold that in your heart and know that there are people who will support you. The other thing I would say is that I would be super clear with folks. You know, if you want this to happen, are you willing to pay $20 a delivery? Are you willing to, I mean, we're not talking about $5. Most of what we're seeing, I'm seeing some folks who are charging a percentage cost for an online or curbside delivery. But I will tell you that based on what we're seeing, the costs are probably significantly higher than most people have been willing to pay in the past. During the COVID period, they may be willing to pay a little bit more. We've seen less price sensitivity about fees, but I will tell you, prior to COVID, fees were an enormous barrier to the adoption of many co-ops' online platforms. I know a co-op in South Dakota who is an early adopter of online, and they had a nominal fee, I think it was $5 for their delivery, not even curbside, but delivery. And they saw a lot of folks opting away from their service and going to a larger chain that didn't charge at all.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And I have heard, by the way, and some of you might have heard it floating around, a couple of GMs out there saying, or at least floating about that, oh, we've made ours break even, the fee's working. I have seen the numbers behind, I'm sure Michelle has, they're factoring in only the labor hours that they're attributing to picking the order. Not all the labor hours for ordering the food, for putting it on the shelf, for maintaining the store that also went into it. So if you've heard that being whispered around, I have not found that to be factually true when I've actually seen the numbers. Michelle, does that sound accurate?
100%. 100%.
Okay. There's a lot of questions here. I'm going to go to a couple of Lori's. Now, keeping in mind, Lori is the general manager of a startup that's about to open. She's saying it'd be helpful to know, you know, have the online sales shopping options though impacted sales? Are people seeing sales growth due to it?
So this is a really terrific question, Lori. We have actually seen not really sales growth related to that. We've actually seen a shift from someone who would have shopped in store to the online platform. We have yet to see real data that people have brought in new shoppers because of this service. Essentially, they're converting existing shoppers from in-store to online. Now, I do want to say that it is very possible that those shoppers really don't want to go in-store and they're going to go wherever it will take to get that online service. So they may be an in-store shopper now, and since you don't offer that service, they might be willing to go to somewhere else to get it. I really do want to recognize that there are probably some proportion of people who are in that boat.
Okay, and so I'm going to jump to something from Jess at Prairie Food Co-op in Lombard, Illinois. So some people, there was if you came to see my presentation today, one store talked about doing a basics bag. And Jess wondered, is there a way to building your store out that creates space in the back of the store for fulfillment of a basics bag, you know, with potential add-ons that might change each week, basically kind of that recipe idea Valley did that they presented about yesterday. Is that kind of compromise something that may be more space and labor efficient long-term?
You know, I think that I actually really love that program. I think that program really simplifies things. You tell them what you're going to give them. Mm-hmm. You have a specified price, and you know, it's easy to replicate it. You're not going and picking specific things for different people. So I do think that something like that could potentially be an option that could scratch some kind of itch, particularly during this pandemic time. I'm not, you know, I think one of the things we got to recognize is that what's going on now, who knows what in 12 months or 24 months the reality is going to be. I can tell you that I have no idea. And it could change dramatically. But in in your planning, I think you really have to just be looking at what your current market conditions are and build flexibility into whatever it is that you do.
And we are, by the way, guys, meeting with Nicole Klimek next week from Seven Roots on specifically on how she's already changing store design to to basically keep in mind what's happening now with COVID-19. So it's a good question to bring back to her about creating, consciously creating flexible spaces that might be able to fulfill these kind of programs in the future. So we'll come back on that. This is a really good question from Foodshed, as also in McHenry, Illinois, and startup, and said we had flip phones and Blackberries for a while. You know, it was just interesting, and people enjoyed those for a while. But perhaps like online grocery buying is now. Then the iPhone came along and changed everything. Can you imagine an innovative leap like that coming for online grocery? Do you foresee that this is kind of the awkward phase, and there's going to be a very different solution long term?
I absolutely do. And I think that it's probably going to come from the big guys, and I think it's likely to be around automation. And I think it's probably not going to integrate well with what our historic strategic focus has been. You know, I think for a lot of food co-ops, they've really tried to keep the human touch engaged in their businesses. And what we're seeing around e-commerce, and I think that the likelihood that those are the folks who are going to be able to make it pencil out first are the ones who are going to robotic automation. And it sounds so futuristic, but the future is absolutely now, and it's happening already in many of Amazon's warehouses. So it doesn't surprise me that that's coming. Our ability to innovate around something like this, boy, we've been so good at coming up with great ideas in the past, but this one might be a bit of a stretch. The deep pockets that you need to be able to experiment, to make investments in technology and infrastructure, and then realize, oh, that doesn't work, and then rip it all out and do something different. Co-ops are terrible at sunk costs. We are really horrible at saying, oh yeah, we spent a lot of money on that and it didn't work, so we're going to scrap it. We're really, really bad at that. We'd rather drive that dead horse until we can't possibly drive it a day longer.
So having said that, can I ask if you personally, I mean, do you still see a significant role for food co-ops knowing that we might not be able to solve this one 5-10 years down the road?
Absolutely. I do think that the role that we have in creating connections, I mean, really that for 40 or 50 years has been the strength that we've had as organization, is connecting people to local producers, connecting people to one another. There are always going to be folks who want that third place in their lives. And you can actually start to see it happening now as states have reopened. We have actually seen customer traffic start to increase again in our food co-ops. Customer counts are going back up. All of the things that, you read in the paper, the trades, people are saying, oh, well, I intend to continue to buy online even post-COVID, but that's not really what we're seeing, primarily because everybody's kind of bad at it still. Even the big guys are not great at it.
Interestingly, I have to bring this one up because I need to hear your thoughts on it. So there's kind of this feeling, this comment came up and I've heard it once or twice already, which is, oh, so maybe this will drive co-ops back to the volunteer labor days. And I'll address that by sharing an article on why it's illegal on several levels mostly. But Michelle, do you have thoughts to share on that?
Here's what I'll say about volunteer labor. I actually think there are places where volunteer labor in co-ops is totally appropriate, and that kind of engagement is great. It's not on the retail floor, but it is in community connections, in education, and find it's not cut and cheese like in the old days, but there are still tons of places where I think people could and should engage in their co-ops, and it would make us all a lot better.
I will say that I know it's incidental my experience, but I got it from a lot of other GMs. We had a volunteer labor program in the main store, and I stood by it for a long time because I love it and I love what it does to the culture. And it was pointed out to me that if I got rid of it, that I would have a lot more efficiency from just hiring the staff for the amount of money we're giving away in discounts. I did not believe that. It ended up being extremely true. Volunteer programs don't save you money actually, and that's a whole different day, but like in center store also there's all sorts of legal and insurance issues that are very tough to overcome. So that's not an anti-volunteer program. There's a place for volunteer programs, but I don't think it'll solve our labor issues, nor did it in the past actually. Those of us who were there remember a whole lot of staff who were getting paid part-time who worked 50 hours a week, and a bunch of volunteers who didn't show up. So moving on from that, I am going to, so we got some other good ones. I want to go to some stuff Dana said from Chicago Market. I'm going back up. Have you identified any specific departments that might benefit or suffer from trying to execute on e-commerce? Curious how this might actually work, how this actually works on the department level. Are there winners and losers?
Absolutely, and there is actually some great data out there if you look for it. We have seen fresh departments essentially just don't exist in e-commerce. Even when it's available, people don't choose fresh food in e-commerce platforms while it is available. So produce suffers a bit unless it's packaged, which has all kinds of other implications. We see delis essentially just tank. We have not been able to get people interested in buying prepared food products through e-commerce platforms. If you look at the larger grocery e-commerce world, things that we saw early adoption on and that were selling incredibly well through e-commerce platforms even before pandemics were things like pet foods, paper products, cleaning supplies, kind of that real shelf stable stuff, you know, the stuff that all of you secretly run to Target to get because you don't buy it at the co-op. It's that kind of stuff. It's those things that are real easy to ship and buy. Things like pet food were, that surprised me how much that was a part of it. There were some subscription-based kinds of consumer product things where, you know, like every month they send you toothpaste or laundry detergent or things like that. And center store is a lot easier, although even that hadn't really reached much adoption pre-COVID. But during the COVID time, it really is kind of that packaged that is moving online faster than fresh.
All right, excellent to hear that. We have a lot of push to talk about platforms, and here, let me ask you guys, I'm pushing that to the last 5 minutes, and here's my reason, because you don't know about a platform that Michelle doesn't, and that Michelle hasn't researched. She's happy to give thoughts on it, but we're not here to solve that. What I want us to hear from Michelle is what's happening and what's the reality, and what might happen in the near future. And we did have someone actually suggest a hackathon to solve this, and that's cool too. It's just beyond the scope of what we're trying to really do here today. Others have questions about planning for startup food co-ops and talking about online services. Some of you are actually in urban dense communities like Chicago Market, like South Philly. So I know that there's this feeling we have to do it, you know, whether or not, like in a town where I am, people say they want it, but you don't have to do it. People will still support the food co-op without that. Do you think, Michelle, there is a point of urban density at which a co-op is probably going to have it, even if small?
I think that it makes a lot of sense, particularly and I'm going to talk about a window of you're going to open in the next, say, 24 months, when we know that there is going to be a lot of health-related reasons that you're going to probably have to deal with customer metering, social distancing requirements. I you know, unlike our president, I actually think it's unlikely that we're going to have this solved in 12 months. I think that this is probably a little bit of a longer term window before we get our arms around this, particularly because our response has been so disjointed. So long term, I think that there are some places where you're probably going to have to figure it out. However, I do think that you're going to have to be real upfront about how you build your budget around it and how much you're going to charge for that benefit. That's going to be tough, and you're going to have to know what's going on in your market. What are other people charging? How much are the competition willing to lose on that? And that's going to tell you whether or not you're going to be able to actually do it. Whether it's needed or not, you're going to have to be able to come in close to what the competition is charging. And if you're too far out of whack, it's going to really drive down the volume of your program. And in the end, it's going to probably do more harm than good.
So one of the things, Michelle, you mentioned one of your slides that kind of got passed kind of quickly was, can some of the cost of this be put into your membership programs? You will have a line in your pro formas, in your budgets, where there's so much money to spend on member support, and member programs. Now, that's also where things like your Food for All programs get paid for as well. So again, remember Michelle's, what are you going to have to give up to pay for this? But are some co-ops paying for it out of like member services benefits and only offering it to members?
I'll tell you, I don't think, I know of one co-op of the many that I've talked to who've actually made some really proactive decisions to try to mitigate the cost of the program. Many of them, it's going to be like a brick between the eyes in a couple of months when they really do the analysis and see what it's costing them. Then I think people are going to have to look at it. We're trying to get out in front of that and say, okay, look, we know it's costing you money, and we also know that you're committed to this. You know, the horse is out of the barn, right? It's tough to put the genie back in the bottle. If people have already launched these things, we've got to figure out how to help them at least be sustainable through this process. So what we're trying to encourage people to do is think about, all right, are you going to take money out of member meetings? Are you going to take money out of education classes? Are you going to take a little bit of extra margin in certain categories to help buffer the costs of these programs? I think we really have to dig in and make some hard choices about that.
I'm going to do one more question that is not related to tech, and then I'm going to let you tech folks go, okay? Grant had a good question. We're hearing about co-ops and the big guys. Is anything going on with non-co-op independents? Anything of note with this issue?
I will tell you that if I want to separate independents into 1 or 2 store independents versus chain independents. Most 1 and 2 store independents are third-party outsourcing. Instacart is very popular among a lot of those groups because the tech is already there. There's, you can have their people do the picking, they do the delivery, they have a curbside option. It's all packaged up and it's there. And it's expensive. I think on average we've seen Instacart for delivery is about 8% of the cost of the delivery is the fee back to you. So think about your 2% margin and you're paying 8%.
So you're losing money.
Just want to toss that out there. I think for curbside it's about 4%. So that's, it's not really financially very appealing, but it really limits, you're not really saving money by bringing it in-house either. You're adding a whole lot of other headaches as well. And in many cases, we see in-house programs cost even more than that. So something to keep in mind. Bigger chains, that's the thing about e-commerce is that no one has figured it out. So there are so many different things going on. There are tons of people, lots of developers, young guys working on platforms. Really, the platform itself is not the issue. You know, in some cases, the cost of the platform can be pretty high. You got to look at that. But the platform itself is not really where this hits you. It's the labor side of it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one last question though. So there was some interest in how do we analyze the cost of e-commerce? Like, what are there metrics or formulas out there? I want to say also, when we get into the tech conversation, we're focusing on those who still want to organize brick and mortar food co-ops. If you want to talk about possibly like maybe we just don't do brick and mortar at all, and we just do, that's a conversation for a different day. I want to use Michelle's expertise where we are. So, are there formulas or metrics out there that people can use to analyze the cost of e-commerce?
Well, what we've done, and I think one of my slides kind of talked about what are the things that you want to take into account. And as you go back, you can look at that. I do think that inside of the CCMA materials, there may be access to a worksheet that people can use to do some down and dirty analysis that will give you an average cost per transaction. So that's something that probably exists out there, yeah.
So Willie Street presided that, and I'll try and get my hands on that and get that out to you guys. I don't know.
I want to make a note though about Willie Streets, and we used Willie Street in working on trying to develop one for us to share with NCG members. One thing that's not included in the Willie Streets is all of the costs of labor for ordering, procurement, and stocking on the front side before you start picking. And that's a critical piece that has to be added in there. So it's not impossible to tweak Willie Streets, but just be aware of that as you're using it, that you probably need to add a certain percentage of the cost of your transaction back in for those before you pick costs.
That's what I'm seeing a lot of. Okay, so I'm going to let it loose because we only have a few more minutes. I'm not going to do my usual wrap up, so you get every minute with Michelle. So people are talking about, what about, you know, there's all these tech companies coming up with aggregators, being able to connect people, growers to farmers, direct to consumers. That's not really that's not really something retail grocery stores can utilize. Those things are out there. And you can form a different, if you want to do a buying club.
That kind of bypasses us altogether.
Yeah. So if you wanted that.
Bypasses us altogether. Yeah.
So, and there are people doing buying clubs as co-ops, and always have been, and you can do that. It's a different thing. It does lower volume. So we had some questions from Keith. Where to go? Keith, I'm going to unmic you and just have you ask them. It was about software because I can't find your comment. Can you just let us know?
Because of COVID and a lot of people staying at home, we were forced to do home deliveries. And it's kind of chaotic, and I was wondering what kind of software is out there to organize or to determine the most efficient route and timing of doing home deliveries in your community. And again, we're kind of forced into that given the COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, I will tell you that logistics software like that exists. I am unaware of any co-ops or any small scale version of that that might exist. Most of it is for like big trucking companies and things like that, which would be out of the cost range of most independent retailers. But who knows, maybe somebody has an app that they're working on developing right now. I'm just not aware of any, I'm afraid.
And when you said that when it comes to software, co-ops using all different ones. I know that NCG launched Mercado. Is that what most co-ops are using, or are you finding everyone's using everything and it's pretty equal?
So I want to be clear that NCG does not officially endorse any platform.
Oh, okay.
But we had tons of people coming to us saying, what should we use? And so we had done a lot of background research, and we said two things. One is, if you already use the ECRS point of sale platform, they have an e-commerce module that is very fast to stand up and deploy, but it requires a lot of in-house management. So it's something you have to keep in mind. It's relatively cheap, There aren't a lot of ongoing costs, and you can get it deployed pretty quickly. The challenge is all of the help desk, and any of you who were on the CCMA session yesterday heard about how much tech support shoppers really need with most of these platforms. All of that's going to be on you if you use ECRS's platform. So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay.
The second platform that we said, hey, this is something you could look at is Mercado. And Mercado is a platform that's used for a lot of independent kinds of businesses. It's not just for grocery, but it allows you to set up your own store within a marketplace. So Mercado actually does marketing that can draw attention to your store inside of that marketplace. So there may be multiple grocery stores in your region using it, but based on location or the type of products you're looking for, Mercado can direct you to that. The other thing we liked about Mercado is that they have a couple of different price tiers. There's an all-inclusive tier where they provide a lot of extra help desk and tech support for shoppers. They can offer a delivery function as well. And then there's a stripped down version where essentially they provide you the place in the marketplace. They give you the software, they charge you just a real basic per transaction fee, but none of the extra support is available in there. So you can decide what it is you want. Compared to the costs of things like Instacart, one of the challenges with Instacart that we found is that Instacart doesn't necessarily allow you access to who your shoppers are. They own that database of shoppers. And that data, by rights, we think we ought to own and we ought to have access to. And Mercado allows that, whereas Instacart doesn't. So there are lots of little nuances that you really have to kind of dig into about these platforms. And shopper data is really important to you long term. It's a way for you to connect with people, and making sure you have control and access over that is really important.
We have kept you beyond time, so and there's actually some more great questions coming up, but I think that the reality is we've already kept you over time here. So there was last question: are Mercado's claiming that people are seeing a 14% boost in sales? Are stores actually seeing anything like that? I've heard from GMs they're seeing more 1 to 4 after using Mercado boost in sales.
I can't speak to that. I don't know specifically.
All right, we are going to thank Michelle for her time and wrap this up. I know we don't want to. I can tell people are riveted and have more questions, but I really want to thank Michelle. It was huge for her to be here with us today, really hard for her to make the time, so I really appreciate it. This recording is going to be out there. Unlike with most speakers where they're usually like, here's my contact info, Michelle cannot take a whole bunch of contacts from startups because of her busy, intense job with open co-ops. If you have questions for Michelle, please send them my way, and I will find out if it's something I can answer or if I really need to ask Michelle. Okay, thanks everyone for being here. Our next session is Friday. Thanks again to Michelle. We'll talk to y'all soon.
Have a great week, everyone. Stay safe. Be well.